with sales, you get prepared. If you're really, really well prepared, then the improv just comes naturally. Be natural in your environment and just know your stuff so well that it just comes naturally.
This podcast encourages and empowers you to create your own unique real story, develop your own unique real statement, and discover your own unique real self. The power is yours. Good afternoon, Stuart Rice, previously episode 1382 of the 12-Minute Convos podcast. It's been just 2 years, 2 months, 28 days, 15 hours, and 30 minutes since we last recorded that conversation. That was then, this is now. Stuart, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for asking.
I'm so glad to have you back on. I had a ton of fun past 12 minutes on the last conversation we had. Of course, we spoke about Sketch Comedy Podcast Show. We spoke about your son. We spoke about what your new job entailed with the pretty logo that I fell in love with. How have things evolved? What are you up to today?
Well, I'm continuing with the podcast. So that is still a thing. So Sketch Comedy Podcast Show is alive and kicking.
That's great.
Yeah, and I actually have another job that I'm doing. I do sales and management coaching, and I just wrote a book.
Well, tell me more about it, please.
Yeah, so the book is called The Sales Book for People Who Hate Sales, because most people hate sales. They either hate salespeople, they hate buying stuff from salespeople, or they, on the flip side, they have to sell something and they actually don't enjoy doing it. So this book, basically what it is it's a workbook that gets you to understand what's going through a customer's mind and how to best approach when you're selling something to somebody.
That sounds like fun. So was improv a part of this? Because I know in improv it's on the spot, right? And of course, sales is something that requires a versatility of situations on the part of the salesperson, right? So what was the preemptive view that created you to listen to that voice that you needed to do this book?
Well, you're right. There is a lot of improv in sales. And the interesting thing is you look at the masters of improv, the biggest secret is they're not improvising 100% of the time. They actually have a really good idea of what they're going to be doing next. They practice a lot, and they actually have an idea of where they want to take whatever scene they're in. So I do the same sort of approach with sales, is you get prepared. If you're really, really well prepared, then the improv just comes naturally because you don't have to think. And there's two things I hate to see in a sale. I hate to see customers thinking, because when customers are thinking, they're not buying. But the other thing I hate to see is I hate to see salespeople thinking, because if salespeople are thinking, they're not selling. The idea is just to be natural in your environment and just know your stuff so well that it just comes naturally.
I'm guessing you've read a ton of books as well, right? And that has allowed you now the skill, which is really interesting how it works, right? You listen to podcasts, you create a podcast, you're reading books, and now you've written a book. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yeah, and again, practice makes permanent. So just like with podcasting, I don't know, your first 4 interviews might have been masterful, but my first 4 episodes of my show were a train wreck.
Yeah. I laugh at my 4 episodes immediately. I'm laughing.
Yeah, exactly. So I think about anytime anybody asks me like, hey, I want to start a podcast, what do you suggest? My first suggestion is record 5 episodes and then throw them away, because you're never going to use them. Just get it out of your system. And then by that time, you'll actually, you'll have an idea of what it is you actually want to talk about, what it is you actually want to do. It's practice, and it's a lot of listening to other podcasts and making notes about things you really like, things you don't so much like. When I read books, if I read a physical book, my highlighter, I go through multiple highlighters, because, I'm highlighting passages that I really like. And it's the same sort of thing with a podcast. Is I'm listening to a podcast, I'm like, man, that sounds like a really cool idea that they had, or that's a really nifty way to take that. And I also listen for podcasts for things where I'm like, I am really bored. why are they talking about this?
Hmm.
And I try not to do those things in my podcast.
Yeah, yeah, sounds like a good idea. Sounds like a good idea. Now, the co-host is in there, right? I forgot her name. Is it Alicia? Is it?
Yeah, so the my podcast took a change. It changed.
Okay.
So instead of having a co-host, she's actually got a very successful podcast in her own right. She has a true crime podcast that she
Oh.
does called Murder in the Rain, and I can't stand true crime, so she does that. That's cool. So instead, what I do now is I invite interesting people, like you would be a perfect candidate for this, but I invite interesting people to have about a half hour conversation, and then at the end of it, we improvise a comedy sketch based on what we talked about.
Yeah, and that's the guest and you, right?
Yeah, that's just the guest and I.
Wow, yeah, that sounds like fun. Yeah, I'd love to do that because I'm thinking immediately. I wanted to ask you to improv on immediately selling me a suit, right? A three-piece suit that's not my size. What would you do? So, yeah, I would love
Oh,
that.
sure. Okay. All right. Well, hey, welcome to Stuart's Suit Emporium, where we've got the best suits for the cheapest prices. Can I get your name?
My name is Angel. I'm not too much on the cheap thing, though. There was one time I met this woman and I used the word cheap, and she immediately blew off on me. She said, "Cheap? No, no, no. It's one thing if something is inexpensive, but cheap, that just means that I'm cheap, and I'm not cheap."
That's right. You're absolutely right. I shouldn't be using the word cheap. What I meant by cheap is that we use the finest feathers from canaries in some of our suits. So when I say cheap, I mean literally the sound cheap, because that's what you'll hear in the background as I'm selling you a suit, because that's where we get all of our materials. Here, why don't you follow me over here to our testing area, and I'm gonna go grab a suit for you, and we'll give it a shot, see what it looks like.
That'd be great. Now, do you have any cheap coffee as well?
Oh, cheap coffee right over there, right next to the cheap donuts that I've got on the table right over there.
Oh, this is too much fun. Yeah, definitely.
All right, well, I've got a suit here for you. Why don't you try it on? This one's you'll notice the color. As I said, canaries. So this is a beautiful yellow suit. I think it'll look fantastic with you.
Definitely matches my eyes.
Yeah. Oh, look at that. That looks beautiful on you.
Oh, this is amazing. So this is what improv is, right? Where we're
Yeah.
playing this and we're walking through that, and it's
Yeah.
just fun, isn't it?
Yeah, it's adult make believe.
Mm.
What you do is you put yourself in a character, and then you put yourself in a scenario, and you don't try to make it funny. It eventually just turns out funny.
Yeah, yeah,
And that's the big thing I tell everybody that's on the show is don't try to be funny. If you
yeah.
try to be funny, it's not funny. But if you just let it happen, funny happens.
Now, isn't that life though? That there's a natural way of things occurring that's beautiful, that should not be touched. And have you seen that in your life? Now, you have three children, right?
Yeah,
With various ages, right? Have you seen that occur?
absolutely. So kids are a perfect example. So kids are really funny up until the age of 3, when they realize that if they do something that's either accidental or they do something or say something silly, that people get a really big reaction out of them. So then they start at right around the age of 3, they start to create those scenarios. So they stop becoming cute and charming and just, funny, like naturally funny, and they try to force it. And they
Hmm.
do that from age 3 to about age 15. They're just trying to just forcibly be funny. And it's a time for them to learn, because most of the time what happens are a lot of eye rolls and a lot of groans, but eventually they learn, oh, this is actually funny. And so
Hmm.
you'll get this gap of from 3 to 15, and then after 15 they start to be funny again, because they start to realize in their environment they can create that. And then as a dad, as soon as I had my first kid, I became unfunny again because I started telling dad jokes.
I wonder if I'm in that category. I mean, we have three children as well, 10, 5, and 5 months at the time of this conversation. And yeah, I wonder if I'm still funny.
Oh, probably not, but you'll be funny to them for a little bit, which is really fun.
Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, my friend, it is such a grand opportunity, I'll tell you, though, Stuart, to check in and to hear that you've continued on your path, that you've not given up on what's your calling. In fact, it's evolved rather amazingly as well into how to help people with sales, which is very fascinating. Of course, amazing audience, if you didn't hear it, the name of that book is The Sales, a book for people who hate sales, right?
Yes.
And of course, you can check that out. There's a conversation that I've started opening up, a bit morbid, if you would, one person said, but how do you function with the conversation of death in your daily planning? Is it something that you put in the background of your mind, or is it in the forefront that you could die today or tomorrow?
It's actually, this is a conversation I had recently with a number of people, is where we don't talk about death enough. My parents are older, so my dad is 90 and my mom is 82, and we haven't had that conversation. I realize I have to start having that conversation with them because I don't actually know what they want to do at their time of death. I also realized, what happens if I get hit by a bus? My kids have no idea what my wishes are. So I think it's really good to have that really blatant conversation. You have to be tender around that subject because sometimes it can be trying, but I think it's a good conversation to have, just to even start the conversation with, hey, what do you want to do if something happens? And then let it evolve from there naturally. Just like with improv, just like with anything else, is just let it evolve. What are your fears around death? And you can talk about that. And it's amazing. Everybody's got similar fears. It's one thing that we can all agree on, is death is scary. And so I look for that common ground. And if you can get that conversation going, start with loved ones first. It's not a bad conversation to have.
Well, I appreciate you, my friend. I appreciate you coming back on. Again, it's motivational and inspirational, right? That you've not given up. Stuart, in closing, is there anything else you'd like to share with our amazing audience?
No, I appreciate the time, and if they are interested in the book, please visit ithinkihatesales.com, and you can see some information about the book, some excerpts, things of that nature, and you can decide whether it's the right book for you.
Of course, you can always check out the podcast, right, as well as Sketch Comedy Podcast. That's really cool as well. All right, well, Stuart Rice, again, a great pleasure, one which I treasure. Thank you for being on What is Inspired by 12-Minute Convos with Angel Jones. This podcast is produced by Pod Edits. Visit podedits.com for professional podcast publishing.